So hi everyone and welcome. So we're excited today to have you join us for an interesting session on how to make your land more profitable. My name is Rich Henry. I'm a director of client success here at LandGate. Today we're joined by two speakers, one of which is Craig Kaiser, who's the president and co-founder of LandGate, and then we also have actually one of my clients, Max Nova, who's the co-founder of Natural Capital Exchange. So Max brings well over a decade's worth of experience around land monetization strategies. So for example, like recreational land leases, carbon credits and timber, and also probably most importantly for some of you on the call, how to establish generational wealth. So today we're going to dive into some real world strategies to help generate that passive income from your land, and we'll also touch on tax strategies and also cost share programs and how to figure out which opportunities are a best fit for your property. So before we dive into all that, I'm going to pass it over to Craig for a quick introduction on LandApp and also LandGate and how landowners and real estate professionals like yourselves are using it to evaluate and monetize their land.
Thanks, Rich. Yeah, and for those of you who have joined our webinars before, as Rich said, this is being recorded. It's going to be sent out in an email. We'll also include Max is going to go through a really nice presentation that he put together. That presentation will be sent out as well. So, our goal with this webinar series, we do these. I think we're on a bi-weekly pace right now. But is really get as much information out to landowners, land professionals, real estate agents as possible. Give you guys as much horsepower you can possibly have in your stable to give you the best decisions possible. And NCX is a really interesting company that, for those of you who are historical landowners, is going to put quite a few new options out in front of you that you may not have considered before as far as making revenue on that land. With that being said, LandApp, I mean, quick plug here, LandApp, we're proud of the product we've built. It is a mobile app where you can get information about your individual property on a parcel by parcel basis. So it's essentially you put a scientist, an engineer, any technical person, we basically put them in your pocket on our app. As well as that, it's also a listings marketplace. So anyone who's interested in trying to generate revenue from their property, LandGate is a completely free of charge marketplace where you can list your own property for leasing. So if you want to lease your property out, generate revenue through leasing, or if you want to sell your property or sell payments on a property, sell royalty payments, wind payments, solar payments, oil and gas payments, you can do that as well on LandGate. Like I said, there is no listing fee. You manage your listing. There's no obligations to accept list or offers that come in, and there's no commission. So if you get a deal done, there's no fee. You're essentially marketing your property yourself, and it gets out in front of all the different developers of those resources. The app itself is a really, really useful tool to landowners. For $6 a month, you can go ahead and get access to parcel boundaries across the United States, as well as the ownership information. So if you want to learn about your property, the neighbors, their neighbors, you can get that for $6 a month nationwide. But what we do, we put proprietary data that we have generated. You see that there on that picture on the right. We go ahead and tell you from a 0 to 100 score what your highest and most valuable uses are on that property, as well as some unknown risks that may be on the property as far as oil and gas contamination, industrial contamination, blackout risks, things like that. Our scientists and engineers have gone through and created those indexes and applied them directly to your specific parcel. So if you're interested, you can go ahead and download LandApp for free. You can get a free property report on your own property. Looking at the QR code here, again, if you want nationwide coverage, as many reports or property reports, views that you want, looking at it to your heart's desire, you can get that across the United States for $6 a month. Right. So moving on, Max, I'm going to go ahead and kick it over to you. You have a really exciting product with NCX. And before you get going, I I was blown away. I just looked at your LinkedIn page, Max, and looked at your educational background and your background in general. Before you get into it, I'd like you to just cover that a little bit. Talk about your experience, your educational experience, your professional experience, just so the folks on the call understand I mean, I mentioned horsepower earlier. I think you are the definition of that. So let them know what your credentials are, and let them know really the type of information that they're getting from you. So um, go ahead and kick it off if you'd like.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Craig, for a overly generous introduction here. But yeah, thanks everybody for showing up to this webinar here this afternoon. I'm Max Nova. I'm the CEO and one of the founders here at NCX. And yeah, it's been a journey for me personally to start this company. I actually grew up in Louisville, Kentucky originally, and that's I spent a bunch of time out in the woods growing up, and that's really what got me into forestry and land management in general. I went to Yale for undergrad. They got to take somebody from Kentucky every year, so I was the guy my year. I met my co-founder at the School of Forestry. Yale actually has the oldest school of forestry, it turns out, in the country, and so uh, I just fell in love with the practice of forestry, how to manage these complex systems because they provide so much value to landowners, to our civilization at large. Everything in the world is either grown or mined, and a lot of that happens in forests, and all the rest of it happens on land, right? But they're like, I come at this from a very sort of forest-centric perspective, but many of those lessons from the forest perspective apply equally to many other types of land and rural property in general. And so that's what we'll talk about today. And at NCX, the way we sort of think about ourselves is that we're sort of like your personal advisor to help you with this really valuable asset that you own. And so, places like LandApp are great to sort of see some of the options that you have. And then when it comes time to actually put together a pretty detailed plan, consider potentially multiple options all at once, and what that means for your cash flows and ultimately what that means for your ability to keep the land in the family and achieve your goals on the property. That's where we really specialize in working with landowners and using a lot of data to do that. And so let me pull up my screen here and we'll dive in, and happy to keep this a little bit more interactive too. So as we go through this presentation, don't be shy about sending in questions, and yeah, we can sort of take them as they come in or batch them at the end, Craig, just depending on however you
Yep.
want to play it. But yeah, so today we're going to be talking a lot about improving the profitability of your land, or like improving the cash flow of your land, or the financial sustainability of your land. At least, I'm always a little reluctant to say profitability of your land because it is often hard to get rich on just managing something like timber. And when I talk with landowners, one of the very first questions I ask is, are you in the red or are you in the black on your property? And if you're in the red, how far in the red are you? And are you concerned that that's going to make it difficult to keep that land as you pass it down to the next generation, right? If it's a big burden for the next generation, it really decreases the chances that you keep that property in the family. And I know that's a major priority for many, many landowners across the country. And the good news is there's a lot of options. There's a lot of ways that you can improve your cash flow, and maybe not quite, get like super, super profitable, but at least maybe go from deep in the red to less in the red, or go from marginally in the red to into the black. And those sort of things make a big difference. Yeah, they go straight to the bottom line for landowners, and that makes a big difference for your families. So let's get into it.
Max, I think real quick before you jump in, I think that's a really critical point that you just hit on there is that the profitability on land is very, very difficult to do. But a lot of the landowners out here listening, they've owned the property, it's been in the family for quite a while. And the red portion financially of the property is every year they're paying property tax, right?
Yep.
So is this going to go ahead and turn someone who's leveraged and bought a bunch of property, is this going to turn them into a positive cash flowing asset? Probably not, but it's going to help reduce whatever payments them are. And then for the legacy landowners there, as far as that property tax that they hate paying every year, and I don't blame them, but that's the negative financial hit, and they're trying to find ways to cover that. Some of these programs will more than cover those property taxes.
Yep.
So I think it's a really critical thing that you just touched on there.
Yep. Yeah. And we'll get more into all that too. And then I do want to preface all this by saying I am not a lawyer. I am not a CPA. None of this is actually financial or tax advice, but I do want to point you towards some resources that will help you figure out the right questions to talk about with your lawyer, with your accountant, as you think about how do I keep this land in the family? Because there's actually a lot of programs out there. There's a lot of tax breaks and stuff out there for landowners that people just aren't aware of. And so if we can talk through that on this call, then I think that would be a good use of all of our time. Because at NCX, like ultimately what we want to see in the world are thriving natural capital markets that help landowners prosper, that help, the other people in our civilization get the outcomes on the landscape that they're willing to pay for, and do that in a very scaled, honest, and transparent way, and in a way that really works for rural America. So we work directly with a lot of landowners. We also work with land management professionals, so people like foresters or realtors, right? People that already have the relationship with landowners, but need the data, need the analytics, need the tooling to actually be able to grow their businesses and serve more and more landowners. One of the things that is really striking to me, and a place where I think we can do much better, is how few landowners actually work with a forester. I think the number is something like 10 to 15% of landowners are actually getting professional help from a forester, similar dynamics in a lot of other land use types. Uh, and it's troubling because for a lot of landowners, yeah, I don't know about the people on this call, but when I meet landowners, many of them are in what I would consider a land rich, cash poor situation. And so for many landowners, right, like your land is your biggest financial asset, usually by a pretty significant margin. And and to be trying to navigate all of the tax stuff, all the cash flow optimization, all these programs, like it's a full-time job. It's actually like running a little mini business. And a lot of people are trying to run what is essentially a small family business without much support. And there's things that LandGate and LandApp are doing to help with parts of that process. NCX, we're very focused on sort of the cash flow optimization part of this, and understanding how those cash flows translate to some of the other values you care about on your property. And so we'll talk more about that in later in this deck. But anyway, suffice it to say that at NCX, we work all across the country. We're heaviest in the Southeast, as you can see here, but we've worked across tens of millions of acres, helping thousands and thousands of landowners access some of these new revenue streams for their property and understand what is the right fit for them and their land, and how do they get something that makes sense for their family. And one of the things that I want everybody to leave this call thinking differently about is that your land isn't just a wall of green. Like when you look at your forest, it's um it's actually a very rich asset that you have, and it's a multifaceted asset that you have, right? The forest is not valuable for just the timber that you can take off the land. It's also got wildlife. It also has soil. You have the potential to capture some of the inbound solar radiation, with solar panels and things like that. Or, the location of your land may be valuable because of its proximity to like data center transmission lines or, whatever, right? There's like a lot of aspects about your land, other than just wall of green, and being able to unpack those and understand how the decisions you make affect each of these assets in your natural capital portfolio. That's the foundation of being a smart land manager or a smart natural capitalist, right? And this is, I think, one of the big transitions we're going through as a civilization right now is the increased willingness to pay for some of these new types of natural capital on your property. I mean, timber has been around for a long time, like cut down a tree, put it on a log truck, send it to a mill. That's actually a pretty mature industry. But doing things like hunting leases to be able to monetize some of the wildlife habitat, or doing carbon credits to be able to monetize the carbon storage on your property, or the carbon in the soil, or taking advantage of government cost share programs that'll pay you to for things that improve biodiversity outcomes. There's so many options out there for smart natural capitalists to take advantage of that can really change the cash flow profile of your property. And so let's get into it, because you may have a natural capital portfolio, and that may be a new concept, but everybody knows you got a bank account, right? And that's what your property taxes are coming out of. That's what all your maintenance expenses are coming out of. That's where the timber revenue is coming in, right? But any decision that you make on your property often has an implication in your bank account and in your natural capital account. And there's trade-offs between these things, right? Like when you harvest timber, you're taking, the trees out of your natural capital portfolio, and so your natural capital goes down, but your bank account goes up. Or similarly, right? Like if you plant trees, for example, you might pay the cost to plant those trees, so it comes out of your bank account, but you're making an investment in your natural capital portfolio. And there's trade-offs between even within your natural capital portfolio, right? Between like how much timber am I going to get versus like what does that do to my turkey habitat? Because I love hunting turkey out in the woods with my grandkids, right? And so this is a very complex asset that you own as a landowner, or that you're helping advise as a forester or other land advisor. And at NCX, what we want to do is give people the tools to make intelligent decisions and make about the trade-offs here and become confident managers of their natural capital portfolios while also making sure the cash flows in the black rather than in the red, because that makes everything else much easier. Craig, looks like you're about to say something, maybe?
No, no, no. I'm just taking a look at some of the questions coming in. We're going to try to get to them when they fit. Max is going
Okay.
to be tough. We got some energy questions coming up here, and I think when you get to the energy portion here, we'll jump in. And just so that everyone knows, again, we do encourage questions to ask as many questions as possible. If we don't get them answered live on the webinar, we will follow up immediately with any type of responses in an email.
Yep. So won't spend too much time here, right? But just like you have a plan with your financial advisor, right? Like everybody on this call probably has a retirement portfolio. I certainly know, like my dad wakes up every morning, opens up his Fidelity app, and he's wondering did number go up or did number go down, right? Like that's a number that really matters to him. And he's spent, a fair bit of time thinking about like, well, what is his plan for this part of his asset portfolio, right? Like his financial asset that he has as opposed to the natural capital portfolio asset in the land, right? But just like you have a financial plan and thoughts about, uh, inheritance and generational transfer and all that, you should really have a similar style approach for your natural capital portfolio. And, all that needs to come together in a plan that triangulates what's your land, what are the possibilities on your land, what your personal goals are for your family, and then what are the different threats and opportunities that exist in the context that you're making this plan in. And so we'll just take these one by one because the goals, like I know this is a talk about cash flow optimization, but it's actually very rare, for me at least, to meet landowners that are purely financially motivated. Often people own land for a mix of financial and non-financial reasons, right? You're saying like, oh well, I mean, all else equal, I would love to improve the cash flow on this property, but like maybe I'm not willing to just totally clear cut everything because actually I do really like taking walks in the woods, you know, and showing my riding around on ATVs with my grandkids through some trails back there and stuff. And I don't, and so some of that, maybe I'm willing to cut some stuff, but like, there's sort of some trade-offs and thresholds that I want to consider there. And making informed trade-offs and understanding what those non-financial preferences are costing you in your land management is a very powerful thing and allows you to make, I think, a pretty clear-eyed decision about how you manage your property and what your plan should be. And whether that's for things like the forest health, or doing the right thing for the land. As I hear a lot of landowners express it that way, or like preserving the privacy on your property, or improving wildlife habitat, or getting the next generation engaged on the property recreationally. All of these are things that like maybe they're compatible with cash flow maximization, or maybe there's some trade-offs, right? But like you as the manager of this property should be easy for you to see what those trade-offs are and make a decision that's right for you and your land. Yeah, Craig talked about some of the work that LandGate does to analyze property. NCX does sort of similar things. There's a lot of platforms out there that'll help you get some sense for what's on your property and like what its potential, its sort of like raw potential is. Some of that is not just about improving your cash flow through making more money, but also making sure that you're just like your financial portfolio, you sort of have a risk return curve and profile that you try to manage. It's like, well, as you get closer to retirement, maybe your threshold for risk goes down in your financial portfolio. And you have a very similar thing that happens with your land as this portfolio of natural capital and understanding, well, what threats do I need to be paying attention to? And like right now, are there actions that I need to be taking to mitigate some of these potentially catastrophic threats? Things like southern pine beetle, if you've got pine in the south. Or are there ways I can make my land more resilient to, blow down in big storms? Or what's my fire risk in these places? All of these are very real things that are going to affect what the cash flows on your property looks like. And making the right decision about where you're managing on that risk return curve for your land is a decision that you shouldn't be making just by default. That's something that you should actually be making a conscious choice about, probably in conversation with your land advisor, because that can be a big swing for your land. And then, of course, there's lots of opportunities to consider. There's solar stuff, there's timber stuff, there's carbon stuff, there's hunting leases, there's recreational leases, there's tiny house glamping communes. I mean, there's all sorts of things that you can do potentially to monetize your land. They all have different risk reward profiles. There's always trade-offs. It's like I meet a lot of landowners that are making a lot of money running their little tiny house glamping communes. And on a dollar per acre basis, that's a pretty compelling return. And it is definitely not a passive income stream, right? There's a lot of overhead and a lot of work to do that. And you got other people on the property, right? And so there's always trade-offs with any of these things. But for any option that you're considering, I would really encourage you to ask, you know, what are the trade-offs? Is this actually a good deal compared to what? Like, do I actually have a full view of the market on this thing? Can I combine this opportunity with other opportunities to improve, to sort of stack multiple things? Like, for example, a good one is you can sign up for a tree planting cost share program and a tree planting carbon program potentially, and then also do a hunting lease all on the same acre, right? And that's a way of stacking potentially multiple revenue streams on a single acre to improve your cash flow on that property. And again, with all of these things, you need to understand what's the risk profile, what's the rewards, like, how's that cash actually coming in? How am I actually going to get paid? Um, and what are the conditions under which I get paid? And then what is participating in a program like this mean for the restrictions that it puts on my ability to do other things that I might want to do on my property? One of the key trade-offs that we help a lot of landowners think through is a timber versus carbon trade-off, right? There's a lot of good carbon programs out there. And you also have the option always to just harvest your timber and sell it to a mill. And the decision that is cash flow optimal for you and your land is, of course, it's going to depend on like the trees that you have, what the growth rates are, all these sort of local factors. But it also really depends on the prices of carbon, the price of timber in your market, and understanding some of that math. It's a little bit of a specialized thing to do, but it really matters when you're thinking about optimizing your cash flow over some time horizon for landowners. And so these are the types of things that, as a informed landowner and as a smart natural capitalist on your property, you really need to be thinking about as you manage your land and think about these different programs. I won't go too much into this, right? But like this is a slide that's probably worth you saving and coming back to just a quick checklist of all the different things that a smart landowner checks on when they are evaluating a program. But like it's a lot. It's a lot to go through all this stuff, which is part of why we have a business at NCX, is helping landowners sort through a lot of these programs and developing a plan and a projected cash flow for like what's actually going to make sense for you and your property. What are the trade-offs you're willing to make? What are the trade-offs you're not willing to make? And pulling all that together in a really easy way. So it's almost like, an easy button for your woods. So last couple slides here before we open it up to questions, because I'd love to have this be a little bit more interactive. But like some of the major categories of things that you can start looking at, almost any landowner can start looking into today to improve your cash flow. And these are things that are pretty compatible with most other land uses that you would consider. government cost share programs are a big one. I would say if you think about the biggest buyers of natural capital in the United States right now, the biggest actually is you. It's everybody on this call that is, taking a hit on their cash flows because they want to go hunt turkey in the woods with their grandkids, right? Or they want to like go ride around on ATV trails on their property, right? Like, and they're willing to take a cash flow hit as opposed to just like, totally clear cutting the timber or, putting in a solar farm necessarily or something, right? Like all of those are things that you're doing because you value some of the natural capital on your property. And so landowners actually, I actually haven't heard anybody else express it this way, but landowners, small landowners in particular, as a class, are the single biggest producers and consumers of natural capital in the United States. But the second biggest buyer of natural capital is actually the government, and the mechanism by which they pay for a lot of these natural capital outcomes are these government cost share programs, which are mostly done through the USDA, Natural Resource Conservation Service. Like whenever you start dealing with the government, it becomes alphabet soup. But the EQIP and CSP are two of the key programs that I would recommend that every landowner check out. And there's a bunch of different practices under here, from like tree planting and like improving the water supply on your property and reducing erosion and like creating pollinator habitat. There's a bajillion different programs out there. You can find them all on NCX, or you can just go directly to the NRCS website and sort through them, but they're all structured as cost share programs. And Craig, one of the things that you and I had talked about when we were putting together this webinar is being really clear about how the money actually comes in for landowners. Like how do landowners actually get paid? And one very important thing to know about these government cost share programs is they're all structured as reimbursement. So you actually go out of pocket and pay for a thing. You submit a reimbursement request then to the government. And one thing that like I've had to learn over the years working with the NRCS, they frame it as a 75% reimbursement, or you can get like a 90% reimbursement if you fit certain demographic categories. Uh, but like 75%, it's not actually like if you send in if you say like, oh, this thing cost me, $1,000 to do on my property. It's not like they're gonna be like, oh, here's $750 because that's 75% of what you spent. They actually just have a fixed rate of they have fixed prices for certain things. They'll be like pollinator habitat is like, $100 an acre, say. And they're like, well, we got that because we're like, oh, $100 is 75% of, I can't do math live anymore, 133 or whatever it is, right? Like the uh so actually it is possible for landowners to make money in some of these NRCS practices, to actually be in the black on NRCS practices if you can execute those practices on your land for less than like their reimbursement rate on those properties, which like, it sort of varies year to year, and those prices get set on an annual basis by local committees and stuff. But they are actually they will pay you for your labor if you do the labor, and there's a fixed rate at which they reimburse labor and stuff. But NRCS programs, if you haven't met your local conservationist at your local NRCS office in like every county, basically in the United States, there's a local NRCS office, and I'd encourage you to go in and meet with your local NRCS conservationist because there's often some good programs there where, especially for sort of like land maintenance activities, things that you were going to go out of pocket and spend money on anyway, this is a great way to reduce those expenditures by getting Uncle Sam to pick up some of the tab. And what he's getting in return are some of these natural capital outcomes on your property. One other thing that's worth thinking about, and again, this is something that you're going to want to talk to your CPA about. And again, like not a CPA here, right? But there is a very different tax treatment of your property depending on whether you are operating it as a hobby or operating it as a business. And one of the key things that the IRS will look at is like your profit motive there, but like and like you'll have to talk to your CPA about what's going to be right here for you. But what you should know is there's just very different tax treatment. And also, if like a hurricane comes through and blows down a bunch of your timber, for example, the casualty loss treatment is very different depending on whether you're a structured as a business or as a pleasure or as a hobby thing. There's also, of course, some legal liability and risk things, owning your land just as a sole proprietor versus owning it through some kind of legal vehicle like an LLC or trust. And again, like as you're thinking about your land as a portfolio, just like you're thinking about your retirement accounts as a portfolio, right? Like thinking about the risk reward profile on these things. These are um, some of the risk mitigation things that you should be thinking about as a landowner. And some of this stuff also goes straight to the bottom line, especially when it comes to like government emergency relief funding stuff, and tax write-offs. So I strongly encourage you to talk about this with your CPA. There's also a really great timber tax website in particular for timber things called timbertax.org that'll walk through some of this stuff. But one of the key things that many landowners don't know is like, what is your timber basis? And if you don't know what that phrase means, this is something for you to talk about with your CPA right away, or you can ping us at NCX and we can help you calculate what your timber basis is. But this starts to really matter because a timber harvest, for example, is one of the biggest natural capital transactions that most landowners will do in their lifetimes. And there's very different tax treatment on that, depending on how you structure it. And like you want to be capital gains rather than ordinary income for that. And there's different ways to achieve that. One other just general tax thing is if you are able to get a agricultural tax, a property tax exemption for your property because you're growing trees, you're growing crops or something, right? You can often significantly reduce your local property taxes through a agricultural tax exemption. And again, that's something that feel free to reach out to us at NCX to help you with that, or like talk to your CPA about that. Um, that's another really important cash flow optimization thing that almost any landowner with rural land, if you have some kind of agricultural activity, even if it's growing trees, can benefit from. So that's all the content I got. I love working with landowners all over the country. So feel free to reach out with any questions that you have. We could take a bunch of questions now, but at NCX, like we're really dedicated to working with landowners, helping you be informed and confident managers of your natural capital portfolios, getting those cash flows right so that you can keep that land in the property and have, it's like and have the property of that you've been dreaming of, right? Like that's what we do this for. Yeah, and with that, Craig, why don't you lead us into Q&A?
Yeah. I'll jump in, and I want to kind of bring everything full circle before we jump into the Q&A, and we have some really good questions we're going to get to here. If I'm sitting in, it doesn't matter what part of the United States, but let's say I'm in North Carolina. I've got 200 acres. I just sat through this presentation, Max, and there's a lot of opportunities out there that you've just laid out. Some of the, I'm going to guess the majority of these opportunities I may have never heard about. And my brain might be spinning. It's like, okay, maybe I could try this and try this and try this. And I get frustrated to the point where, wait a minute, there's so much here. I forget it. I'm too confused.
Yep.
The reason why NCX is such a great company is if I'm that individual and I got my 200 acres in North Carolina, by putting a listing up on LandApp, you get access to that, to me raising my hand saying, I'm interested in making money, right? You would review that, and then you would reach out to me, and you would actually, and the best way I can summarize it, Max, is you're essentially my fund manager, my financial advisor for my property, right? So me as the landowner, I don't need to know the nuances and the ins and outs of all of the stuff that you just went through because you're the expert in it. You already know. So you're going to take a look at my property, and if it's something that fits one of those programs, you're going to pick up the phone, you're going to give me a call, and all I've really had to do was just bring my opportunity into the market. Is that a good summary, Max?
Yeah. Almost like a wealth advisor for your land, right? Is sort of the gap we're trying to fill because it is overwhelming, right? There's hundreds and hundreds of these programs out here, and a lot of the work we do as a company is trying to reduce that overwhelm moment, right? And like really what this should feel like for a lot of landowners is show up, here's my property, whether you create that on LandGate or wherever, or LandApp, and like here's my address, right? So we got your land. Say very briefly what your goals are, right? For a lot of landowners that I work with, it ends up being some combination of I want wildlife outcomes while also increasing the income or improving my cash flow on this property. That's a very common goal set that we get from landowners. And then a lot of our job is to say like, okay, given what we know about your land, given what we know about your goals, we're going to create a plan and projected cash flows for you that we think is going to make sense for what you're trying to achieve on your property. And the thing that's so exciting to me is how many landowners there are. There's 5 million plus landowners in just the forested part of the country that have, 10 plus acres, right? And a lot of those landowners are flying solo right now,
Yeah.
not getting a lot of great help. But using technology, we can reach millions and millions of landowners and help bring those acres into the natural capital economy and help landowners make good decisions that can help their families thrive, help these rural communities that they're in thrive, and help
Yeah.
all of us as Americans, as civilization, to be able to pay for the outcomes on the landscape that we want, and for landowners to be appropriately compensated for the value that their land provides.
That's a really good point, Max, because most of the folks listening, they probably have a full-time job doing something, and that is their priority, right? They're they're either farming, ranching, they're doing something. Making money on their revenues or on their property isn't something that they probably sit around and think about all day like you do, right? So
Yeah.
the technology you develop and through LandApp, it really is a very valuable tool to those folks to getting information out there that typically wasn't even available to extraordinarily large landowners. So,
Well, and a lot of people don't think about it until they really do, right? And like the really do moment tends to be, there's the three classics of death, disease, and divorce, right? Like those are often the things that push, anybody, whether they're a landowner or not, to like really look at get their financial house in order, think about things like generational transition and estate planning and all those sorts of things. Um, and yeah, those are moments that really matter for families, right? Because the
yep,
decisions you make in those moments set the next couple decades in motion for your family, for the land. And so it's tough and sort of scary to make those decisions alone. And that's some of the gap that we want to fill at NCX. But we also work with land advisors all over the country, right? Like we work with foresters and realtors and stuff too, to give them access to these tools to be able to like help the clients that they have make those good decisions.
that's great. I'm going to move on to a couple questions here. We're going to ask one specifically about NCX here, coming in from Brian Hall. And then a bunch of folks have asked about data centers. We did just do a webinar 2 weeks ago specifically about data centers. It is absolutely the gold rush in the United States right now. Data centers are very, very popular. We did a webinar. Michaela, if you would like to put some content in the chat there for folks, link to the webinar, link to the blogs that we put out. We'll touch on those here in a little bit. But Brian Hall asks, Max, for NCX, right? You guys are going to put work and time into everybody's property and hopefully generate some revenue for them. How does NCX get paid? Brian asked, you can't, company's not doing it for free, and obviously it's
Sure.
not.
Yeah.
But if I join NCX and you guys help get me some, I don't know, a forest fire mitigation type program where I'm getting some revenue every year, how do you guys get paid in that?
Yeah. So NCX, we just have a annual membership model. It's $100 a year for most landowners. If you start to get like really big, then like, I hop on a call with the landowners and we talk about it. But for us, it's very, very important that we are totally landowner first at NCX, and the landowners are our clients. The Our revenue is from the landowner side of the equation. So at NCX, we're totally team landowner. Um, the reason we do this business is because there's so many landowners that are flying solo, and it's hard for them to know who to trust, right? And
Mm-hmm.
some landowners already have advisors that they trust and work with, right? But even for those
Sure,
advisors, it's tough for
sure.
them to keep up with all this stuff that's changing, right? And so like, so we work directly with some of those advisors to give them access to the tools. But the reality is like there's this super long tail of landowners in the United States. Millions and millions of
Yep.
landowners are doing this solo, and they need somebody that they can trust to help give them unbiased, comprehensive advice about the most precious asset that they own. And like that's why I get out of bed in the morning to work in
Yeah.
this business. And that's, but anyway, and so we monetize it. Of course we got to make money as a business, right? And we try to make this very accessible to landowners through this annual membership fee. But you can sign up for a free account and see some of the basic stuff, although the more advanced tooling is behind that membership.
Sure. Wonderful. Okay, we're going to move on, and I'd like to hear your opinion on the data center, and a little bit moving more into maybe some of the energy sides of things, which, as the impact on the property is more intensive, obviously the compensation is much higher, right? You can start talking about some solar lease payments where once the project is active, anywhere from 1,000 to, in some parts of the United States, $3,000 to $4,000 per acre per year. But again, that's very intensive. That's very intensive disturbance on the property, right? So we were talking about some solar rates there. On the data center side, someone asked, will companies? Looks like Brent. Thanks for the question, Brent. Will companies lease land for data centers, and what kind of income can that bring in? From what we've seen nationwide, when it comes to data centers, the vast majority of those data centers have not been leasing opportunities. It's been where the data center company has came in and purchased the property outright. Now, I know when you hear, I understand I've come from a rural part of the United States. Max, you come from a landowner family as well. Like, we get it. Most people say, no, I'm not interested in selling the property. Everybody says that until they start having the conversations with the data centers, because it is, when I say it's a gold rush, it is absolutely a gold rush for very, very specific sites. Michaela put some nice resources in the chat of, what allows your property to qualify for data centers and things like that. And just in a nutshell, really quick, a data center is just pretty much a big warehouse full of computers. That's really what it is, but it needs to have access to massive amounts of power, so substations, transmission lines, things like that. Typically, what you will see when you have a site that is good for data centers, a lot of landowners across the United States are listing their property on LandApp specifically to get in front of data center developers, battery storage developers, solar developers. Again, no cost, no fee, no obligation to accept, but they'll put the listings out there and they'll have the conversation between the developers and themselves. And they quickly find out that those data center sites, the battery storage sites, those are typically purchased, not lease opportunities. That those properties are going for 2, 3, 4 times higher than what you would just see a neighboring piece of property bought or sold from. So one data point, this is south of Cheyenne, Wyoming. If you know where Cheyenne, Wyoming is, it's not the most beautiful forest land that Max had in some of his Max had in some of his presentations there. It's grassland. It's either very dry or very very wet and flooding. So it's tough place. It's tough land, but a piece of property was purchased for $500,000 about 5 or 6 years ago. That property was purchased for I won't give you the exact sell price, but over what would that be? Over 8 figures. So a very sizable increase in value for this specific site. Again, the big point there is you just got to raise your hand and you got to get it out in front of people. Well, how do I do that? You can really easily make that listing. It's yours. Delete it whenever you want. Do whatever you want with it. But you put that up on LandApp. Max, do you want to jump in there a little bit, because you guys do a lot of stuff on the solar side as well. Again, the bigger the impact on the property, the more compensation there is.
Yeah, I mean, in general, like I don't have religious views about how landowners use their property, right? Like our job
Yep.
is to put as many options in front of landowners as possible and
Yep.
help landowners make an informed decision about the trade-offs, right? And like there's real trade-offs, right? But there's also real rewards, right? It's like you can potentially, like, on a dollar per acre basis, things like solar farms and data centers or whatever, it's like some of that stuff is extremely high, or turning it into subdivisions, right? It's like, there are like very high dollar per acre land uses that often involve converting the land from, what I would think of as like a natural state to a more developed state, right? But this is like the history of, this country, right? Is like land goes from undeveloped to developed land property prices increase and all that stuff, right? And it's all trade-offs, right, for landowners because it's like, well, we talked in the beginning about your nature, or your natural capital portfolio and your bank account, right? And some of these moves, have some pretty significant, like, zeroing out of a lot of the natural capital portfolio, but a big bump in your bank account. And that's just like, every landowner is going to have different preferences about how they think about that. I will say for data center stuff in particular, like I think you guys at LandGate are doing a phenomenal job of that. We do much less of that at NCX because we're so focused on the natural
Mhm.
capital
Yep.
side of things. One of the questions that I often ask landowners, right, is I say, "Are you in the red or in the black on your property?" Like we talked about at the beginning, and it's informative, I think. How a lot of those answers come back because many landowners say like, well, depends on the time period you're looking at because every year I'm kind of like marginally in the red, but I'm killing it on the real estate's appreciation on
Yep.
this, on just like the dirt,
Yep.
basically. Which I have actually like sort of mixed feelings about that because in some sense, if the only way that you're like really generating big returns on nature is by turning it into not nature, then like what the invisible hand will deliver us is lots of not nature, which it's like my preference would be like, well, it would be nice to have some nature, right? Yeah, and like this is a
Mhm.
balance thing, right? It's a dynamic system, but part of our mission at NCX is to make it the nature side of this equation start to pencil out a little more too, right? But like there's
Yep.
room for all of this stuff on the landscape, and really the exciting thing is the landowners get to decide, and we want to make sure that when landowners decide, they're making an informed decision.
Kathleen Williams has a really good question here. There's been a lot of changes, a lot of frothiness in the political environment. Again, we're same as you, Max. We're going to be completely neutral what people want to do on their property, give them as many options as possible. We're going to try to give as much information out there uh, as possible as it impacts landowners. We're not going to pick sides of one side or the other. But with these changes that are happening, Kathleen asks, will these programs, such as government cost share program, remain viable and continue? What's your view on that, Max?
Yeah, it is. So I was just at like the Society of, or no, the Southern Group of State Foresters meeting, right? Like right as some of like the initial budget numbers were coming out and stuff, and have been following this very closely. And it is very difficult to get a straight answer out of any of the government people on exactly what's going on, partially because they just do not know, right? And it
Yep.
is such a dynamic situation out there now with like
Yep.
the big beautiful bill thing passing. Like I think there's a little bit more certainty in what's going on. But from a landowner perspective, the important thing to know is at least right now, the funding for payments to landowners remains there. Like that has not been eliminated. Now, like there are some things that are worth knowing about, in particular, like a lot of the like conservation technical assistance or state support, state level support for private forestry, support for non-industrial private landowners. A lot of that stuff has been zeroed out. And so there's a little bit of a question of like, well, like if the funding for landowners is allocated, but the traditional mechanisms for like landowners getting access to that have all been zeroed out, how exactly is that going to work? Right. And that's one of the places where we as NCX are really stepping up and helping sort of bridge the gap and help landowners, create their applications for these government programs and put in competitive applications. Um, yeah, it's the funding is still there. The funding is still in the budget for the landowner payments, but the question of how exactly that's going to make it to landowners, I think there are still some things to figure out there.
Okay. All right. Thanks for that input there. Ron has a question. Um, can you give us a specific example of, you know, all these landowners listening? Can you give us a specific example when, landowners raised their hand or you found them, contacted them, where you looked through their property, found a nice program, and they started getting paid? Can you provide an example to the audience for us?
Yeah, sure. So like, because we come from a forestry background and sort of have worked a lot in the Southeast, I'll pull one out of there, right? There's often after a landowner does a timber harvest, they're like, okay, now it's time for me to replant. Uh, And so we help a landowner after they've done a timber harvest, they want to put it back in forest, as opposed to say, for example, converting it to something like a solar farm after a timber
Mhm.
harvest, right? Like which is another move that a lot of landowners,
Sure.
right?
It's another option for them,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah. But like this
Yep.
landowner had decided, for whatever their reasons were that they wanted to do a planting, and so we looked at that and we said, okay, like, well, actually, what species are you going to plant? Like, because that really matters, and there's different funding available, right?
Hmm.
So one of the options that that landowner would consider is like, well, normally in the South, if you're planting pine, you're doing like genetically engineered loblolly pine, because like they've gotten it almost to the point where it grows perfectly straight and square with no bark. Like they're working on it. Like it's not
Yeah.
quite there yet, but like highly optimized for commercial timber production. But there's also other species that you might consider planting, like longleaf, for example, right? And like there's a bunch of programs that will help pay for those longleaf seedlings to get put in because of some of the habitat benefits that they have, right? Or there's another way of doing this where you can actually buy um, you can buy seedlings, get a government cost share for them, and get there's a carbon credit program called Funga, which basically like, they take your seedlings and they inject some like fungus stuff, mycorrhizal, blah, 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 into the root ball that's supposed to help it grow a lot better and store more carbon. And so you can actually participate in this carbon credit program that they have and get some of those ongoing payments. But it's what we help this landowner do is stack all of these things together from the like government cost share to the carbon credit stuff, evaluate these other options to, ultimately get to a place where they were stacking a couple programs together to get their forest stand reinitiated or replanted for basically no money out of pocket. And so, and then, like that's a good example of being smart about pulling together multiple different programs in a way that, it wasn't cash flow optimal. Because I'll tell you, like after a timber harvest, maybe the cash flow optimal thing for that landowner to have done would have been to put in a solar farm or something,
Sure. Yeah.
right? But it's like relative to, like with all the other goals that they had, right? Like this was the right path forward for them, and we helped sort of put together a creative package that made their cash flows much better than they would have been if they just paid to plant out of pocket.
Gotcha. Okay. I think we have time to get through a couple more. Brian had a question come in here, and I think I'm going to handle that one. Is what distinguishes a parcel that gets picked up quickly versus one that sits idle? And that, Brian, it's a good question. That really determines on what you're raising your hand, what you're creating your listing on LandApp for. You have a bunch of different options in there of, whether you want to receive offers for battery storage locations or data centers or carbon credits or mineral leasing or data centers, whatever it is, solar farms. Depending on what, and there's a lot of folks that just select all of them. Like, well, I'm just interested in anybody who's interested in potentially giving me revenue for my property. They check all the boxes. A lot of folks do that, and there's that. Certainly, you can do that. It's really dependent on the developers themselves. It's really, how good of a site is it for a data center? How good of a site is it for carbon credits? How good of a site is it for water, whatever it is? And it's really up to them. We see some listings that'll go in literally within a day or two, and then there's some that will sit for a while because they're not super high value in anything that listing individual has selected. So it's really this. It's parcel by parcel basis of how quickly things will move. You don't necessarily, as far as posting on LandGate, you don't need to work with a LandGate partner. There's a lot of real estate agents that use LandGate and will work with the landowner, help them get their listings up. You don't have to. I'd say the majority of folks that use LandGate system and LandApp, they go ahead and post their own because guys like Max are in there every day looking for properties, looking for listings, looking for you out there ready to work, like raise your hand and say, hey, Max, I'm ready to work with you. I don't know if I have a property that's great, but come take a look at it. So you don't really need to, you certainly can work with someone if you'd like. But, Max and NCX is, again, like I said, it's an interesting company because, you don't really have anybody in your corner when you start having those conversations. NCX is that guy in your corner. They are the company there to help advise you. And that's I think a really really great model there. Max, is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, that sounds great.
Okay. The next one, this is I think it covers probably most of the folks on the call. We don't have a lot of city dwellers, at least their land's not in the city, that listen to these webinars. But an anonymous question came in says rural landowners often do not have the access to infrastructure, grids, energy, solar farms, data centers, and things like that to have super high value. Now, before I get to the second part of the question, I will caveat that that's changing radically. There is massive spending that's going to happen with the grid transmission capacities. This is coming across every county in every state in the United States. Is new substations, transmission lines, data centers, battery storage. It's coming everywhere. However, for folks that still might be away from some of that infrastructure, even planned infrastructure, things like that, what is the quickest way they can get up to speed with some of those problems you were talking about? Is it really dependent on where they're at in the United States and what their properties look like? Is the best way to just pick up the phone and give you a call, Max? But what's the best way for them to get going?
Yeah, probably. I mean, like the first step that we often work with landowners on is just like what are your goals, and then like a little bit of a deeper dive on some of the specifics so that we can determine what programs you're eligible for. And that's one of the things that we've spent a lot of time working on the NCX platform is just like most programs you're actually not going to be eligible for, right? Because like you're too far from a phase 3, power, blah,
Yep,
blah,
yep,
blah, or like, your
yep.
soil isn't right, or your acreage is not in the right range or whatever, right? So like there's a lot of stuff where we help reduce some of the overwhelm just by taking things that you're obviously not eligible for or that are obviously against your preferences off the table, right? And so that
Yep.
narrows it down. And then you can have a much more productive view on that. And like, and if you want to, at NCX, you can get sort of like more premium like consultations where like we'll actually go through this one-on-one with you.
Wonderful. Well, Max, again, it's always a pleasure having you on. You're a wealth of knowledge, and for the folks that were here live, be thankful. You have a Yale grad from the world's most prominent forestry school here to give you guys some information. Leverage NCX; they're a great company. And again, for the folks that have been listening and you're sitting there still wondering, well, how do I get in front of folks? That's why we created LandApp. It's free to download. Go to the App Store. Michaela put some links in the chat. Download that and to get a little bit more information, landowners, property boundaries, nationwide, it's $6 a month. There is no other app out there that can compete with us on that level. And again, any listings, if you're interested in this and want to get your property out in front of some of these developers, no cost, no fee, no commission, no obligation to accept. It's really putting you in the driver's seat. Go to LandApp. If you need help with your listing, feel free to reach out to us. We're more than happy to walk you through that as well. Well, with all that, you will be getting a recording of the webinar. I hope everyone learned something, and hope everyone has a good rest of the week. Thank you all.
Thank you, Sean.